And hi, everyone. Welcome. As Vera mentioned, we will continue here with the English lab session. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Eva Constantaras. She's a data journalist specialized in building data journalist teams in developing countries. So local journalists around the world need the skill and the opportunity to produce data-driven stories on universally urgent issues such as equality, health, jobs, education. And Eva will use examples of data journalism done by journalists in countries where access to statistics and number is very challenging, particularly challenging. And she will also introduce recipes for making data journalism more inclusive and more representative of the communities they cover. So thanks, Eva, for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be here with this group. I live in Greece, but I spend very, very little of my time in Europe. But from what I've seen over these last years, the issues facing data journalists around the world are really converging. So as we see the rise of populist leaders, we see the rise of mis and disinformation. I've seen really a necessity for these conversations to come together. So what this presentation is going to cover is two parts. One is sort of overall strategies for decolonizing data journalism. So how do we make it less elitist? How do we make it more representative of communities? How do we make sure people from those communities can actually enter data journalism? And how do we make sure audiences actually read the data journalism that's being produced about them? And then the second half of the session, we're going to go into a sort of a practical data story recipe exercise in which it would be great if the audience can actually try out one of these basically these entry points for journalists who are wanting to get into public interest data journalism. So again, that's a much more hands-on session about how you can get started in data journalism yourself, and it's using an example from Kenya. So I'll be sharing links when we get to the actual presentation of the data story recipe, but for now, you can just watch this first section. So who am I? So I'm Eva. I'm from the US, but I've lived in 9 different countries. So I have a really good perspective about how data journalism has evolved in different parts of the world and what the West can learn from the rest of the world about how to do data journalism to actually have impact. So I've set up data teams that continue functioning in media houses right now in Kenya and Pakistan, in Afghanistan and Jordan. And what I always tell people, if we can make a data team work there, we can make a data team work anywhere. And I've also developed training materials, sort of these inclusive approach training materials to get journalists all around the world doing more public interest reporting. So I wanted to start out with this Reuters study because I think coronavirus really underscores the common challenges facing both newsrooms and audiences. So what we've seen is all around the world, all of a sudden people want more quality news and information. Nobody really wants to pay for it. We still have a trust crisis in media that needs to be addressed. And we really struggle around the world to engage young audiences. And I think this really speaks sort of to the theme of this conference, which is sort of the decline in trust in media and what we can do to be more inclusive. One thing that really made me excited was to see that local news is really important to people. And I think that is an area of data journalism that has been really neglected. Data journalism tends to be national or international. And I think it's really a missed opportunity to bring communities out to do stories by and about these communities. So we see that there is this demand for local news, but it might be a demand that we are not meeting. So I've got our little media consumer here who doesn't really know where to turn for trusted facts and information. What we see with the coronavirus is people do want accountability reporting. They want to know what their government is doing to keep people healthy. They want more data-driven information about coronavirus, but it's not there. There's really big gaps in the media across the entire world. And one thing I think data journalists need to do, I think we need to the first thing we need to do is take a step back and rethink who our role models are. When we hear about data journalism, we hear about things like the New York Times. We see stories about minority communities produced by these really big data teams in the Capitol. So we get these stunning visualizations and these really powerful stories that we want to emulate around the world. We've got really great cutting edge coronavirus coverage that shows how coronavirus has exacerbated inequalities. But I think there's a problem with looking at these examples. I think the first and most important practical thing is the media houses publishing these really high value interactives. They've got a lot of money. They have really big teams working on these stories. And while practically, I think that's one of the most important findings, I think what we also need to be really wary of is their audiences. So they already have audiences who believe what they're going to be shown. They have pretty partisan audiences that are going to support the message that's been brought out by the data. They also do really nationally focused stories. And I think that's an issue when you see that people really want to see data stories relevant to their communities. Another big issue we see is that most of the staff do not come from the marginalized communities that they are representing. And the data stories are often about people who are never going to read the story in that media because that's not where they get their news and information, right? So you've got all of these divides that are preventing people from actually accessing data stories that are relevant to themselves. Okay, so instead of looking at places like the New York Times and the Guardian and these really big powerhouses, what do we do to start to decolonize data journalism? And I think the first really important step is understanding what is stopping newsrooms from doing data journalism. And I think there's from my experience, there's a few different issues. There's the data issue. This is actually less of an important issue than some of the others, but I do think we see a data gap. I think we also see a simple skills gap. So I think a lot of journalists are data curious, but they don't actually know how to produce data stories. And then I think this third corner, I think this is where we forget to pay attention a lot. And it's editors and publishers are simply not interested in publishing data-driven content. They might not have a very comprehensive digital strategy. They might not really understand data journalism. So they're definitely not going to invest in something that seems difficult to understand, slow, and expensive. In a lot of the countries I work in, this kind of accountability reporting is actually pretty high risk for them too. So there's a pretty high chance of censorship. So I think winning over the editors is a big thing. And then finally, we need to understand our audience better and what their information needs are. So I'm just going to explain how their strategy tackles each of these gaps. So when we look at the data gap, one really simple thing we see happening is media houses and NGOs trying to collect relevant data and making it more accessible for journalists. So this might be on a data hub, on a website, it might be on a GitHub account. But what we see more and more is media houses and journalists trying to figure out what data is out there, what format is it in, and can we make it more accessible? I love this photo. This is a group in Myanmar. So those guys on the left, whose average age has got to be about 15, these are the guys we depended on to scrape all of our Myanmar election data. This is not from this election, this was in the previous one, but they're still at it. So I think relying on our civil society community to help us liberate data is a really good way to bring down that barrier. So working with civil society, working for groups that are already liberating data, one thing I always say is use the data you have, not the data that you wish you had. So work with the data, whether it's health or education data, start building your stories on that data that's already being liberated. You can see for our Jordan program, we set up a really simple CCAN platform so that all journalists could access the data that we had liberated for this program. So again, it makes it easier for the entire data journalism community to find data sets relevant to their beat. So that, I think in one sense, the data bit is actually the easiest part of the equation. I think a much bigger challenge is the skills gap. And I don't think it actually has to do with being a coder or understanding math. I think it really has to do with whether journalists have a research process to be able to investigate a hypothesis with data. So can they follow a process from the beginning to the end of establishing a hypothesis, finding the data, analyzing the data, and telling the story? We saw a lot of boot camps, hackathons, things like this that sort of were innovation theater, but didn't really get to the heart of the basic fundamental skills gap. And I think what we've seen because of things like Brexit, because of the US elections, journalists are more and more interested now in doing their own original analysis and reporting. But I think we underestimated how much effort it was going to take. So we thought that, sending journalists to a 1-week workshop, that would get them some basic data skills. They would go back to their newsroom and produce data stories. I'm sure a lot of you have been to these 1-week workshops, and that has not been the case. I think part of the issue is because what I mentioned before, which is techno-chauvinism. So we assume that the reason people aren't doing data journalism is because they don't have the technical skills, whereas I would argue that they don't have the habits and research process for developing accountability reporting, and they don't have the technical skills. So any way that we want to invite journalists to do more data reporting has to overcome both of those challenges. So later on in the session, we're going to look at a data story recipe that tries to tackle this. So the data story recipe forms the basis of a lot of my training programs. And what it basically does, it takes journalists from the idea for a story through the step-by-step process of cooking your own data recipe. So here's a shot of one of the workshops, and I like this because one of the most difficult parts for journalists is actually once they've done their data analysis and they have their findings, it's how do I do a compelling explanatory narrative that will engage readers? And this is, again, the issue of, are you writing just for policy wonks? Are you writing for an elite audience? Or are you writing for a general audience who just wants to understand the issue? And I think writing for a general audience requires much more thoughtful construction and development of the story idea. So this big storyboarding we've got going on the back wall for us is a really important step in the process to construct compelling narratives. Okay, so here's the most difficult part. For us generally. How do we sell the idea of data journalism to editors and publishers? I think what we found is that editors and publishers can be really confused about what is the value added for data journalism. Coronavirus has led to really big layoffs in newsrooms, and they don't necessarily see how data journalism is good for their revenue strategy. So one thing that we always try to do is how can we incorporate data journalism into their digital strategy, into their revenue strategy. So if they want to be doing more interactives, if they want to do more audience engagement, how can we ensure that the data journalism that their newsrooms are producing actually accomplishes those goals? So how do we assess the needs of the media to find out what is their revenue strategy? How could data fit into it? How do we educate editors and publishers? I think one thing I see, including lots of donors do this, what we see is that there's a lot of grants to do data journalism, but they don't engage the editors and the publishers. So they offer grants for journalists to do accountability reporting, but they don't bring editors and publishers into the conversation. And then you end up with data stories without any place to publish. Or you end up with data stories that are only published in digital sort of elite policy magazines that don't reach the audiences we want. So I think engaging editors and publishers in the conversation from the beginning is really important. Another thing we've seen is funding fellows in newsrooms. So if you take not just like the Google News Fellows, but actually funding year-long fellowships so that data journalists can actually work without the daily pressures of the newsroom to produce more data-driven content. And I've seen a lot of sort of this branded content more and more appearing in places like The Guardian, where donors are establishing these sort of beat-specific data stories, streams of funding, so that we can really integrate that sort of in-depth coverage of a data-driven topic into the newsroom. And then finally, the last model here is the help desk. So I think a lot of data journalists, even once they're trained, they get back to the newsroom and then they encounter problems. They can't get their data set clean, or they can't create the kind of interactive map they want. So having a community with specific talent to help them get over specific problems, I think is really important for data journalists to begin to grow their skills beyond their comfort zone and do more ambitious interactive projects. So here you can see a very non-engaged audience. This was our first meeting with Kenya editors to try to sell them on the idea of data journalism. And what we've got in the end was a data team at the Nation Newsplex, which is the Daily Nation is the biggest daily newspaper in Kenya. And it actually does have a permanent data desk doing public interest reporting. So I think building that relationships with editors and publishers is important to really having sustainable data-driven explanatory reporting. Okay, and then finally, this last element is really touching on the audience. I think data journalists do a very bad job of actually using audience data to make editorial decisions. So when data teams decide what issue they should cover with data, they rarely look at what citizens' information needs are in any sort of quantitative way. So I think we need to do a better job of doing sort of an overall news needs assessment. So really finding out what are the holes in people's knowledge, what is your audience engagement strategy for these data stories so that when you publish them, they actually get to the right audience? And then finally, how are we capturing our engagement with data stories in terms of audience metrics? And this, again, can feed into convincing editors and publishers that this is really a worthwhile strategy. Because if we can show that it boosts audience engagement, that these stories are things that people want to read, we can make the case for more permanent data teams. Okay, so instead of looking at the New York Times and the Guardians of the world, I wanted to draw your attention to all of these other smaller data teams that are, anywhere from 1 to 5 people that are doing really important data work around the world. So you can see on the left, this is the Nation Newsplex in Kenya. that did a deep dive looking at all the inequality being caused by lack of access to quality remote education during coronavirus. And again, this is a topic that is relevant in every single country. Every single country has this issue of inequality, and with students stuck at home, who's really being left behind because of lack of access to internet or supervision. So I think this is a story that really could be modeled around the world. IndiaSpend is a news wire. It's a data news wire service out of India. So they do daily, they do lots and lots of data stories on really basic public interest topics that are picked up by Indian media all over the country. And then at the bottom, there's a story from Malaysia Kini in Malaysia, looking at how ethnic divides are separating students in the public education system in Malaysia, which is, again, kind of a universal topic that everybody could pick up on. So why do I think these are better models for how to do data journalism? One thing they have in common is that they all have a really local focus. They're distributed through lots of different platforms. So the Daily Nation has a television channel, it has a news app, it's got the newspaper. So they've got local correspondents that are also distributing it through local media chains. They're also translated into local languages so that they actually reach the populations that are covered in the story. They're not one-off pieces either. They're slowly building up people's understanding of issues like education. So they do lots of explanatory reporting on this topic, so they have a common basis of fact when they report on this kind of issues. And then finally, they're all tied to audience engagement strategy and feedback loops, which inform the editorial decisions made by the newsrooms. Okay, so how do we get more newsrooms and more journalists to do these kinds of stories? One place that I've been looking at for models is Open News in the US. Open News has started, it's a nonprofit to support journalists and media in their digital transition. And what they started was a series of COVID-19 data story recipes. So basically, they find journalists that are looking at national data sets around COVID-19 issues, and then they're doing step-by-step recipes to help local journalists look at the data for their county or their local hospitals and tell the local story from their perspective. So what do I find smart about this strategy? I think it's really important that it's cleaned, updated data that's available at a really granular level across the country so that any journalist can pick it up and do a really localized story. It also doesn't assume that journalists know what to do with the data. So it's got very easy to follow step-by-step instructions for how to analyze that data. And then finally, I think it's really important that there's a team of experts for in case people run into problems, they can help. So Big Local News has done a data story recipe. Lots of different media have provided these data story recipes with the idea that local journalists can emulate these stories. So I think I'm about halfway through my time. So what I really wanted to do was show you one of these pilot data story recipes. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a minute and give you all a chance to find the data story recipe. And I'll just talk you through exactly what it's about. So basically what we have is a copy of a data story recipe done by Open News, but it's been localized to the Kenya context. So a really common question is, does my county or does my local area have enough ICU beds? Does it have enough ventilators? Does it have enough doctors and nurses? This is an issue we see again and again, no matter what the newsroom. So even though we're looking at a Kenya example, the reason I chose this particular data story recipe is I don't think there's a country where the question of are there enough ICU beds, are there enough ventilators is not relevant right now. So I think we're going to drop the link for the data story recipe into the newsroom. Into the chat. I'm also going to I'll share my screen so that you can see the bit.ly link as well. And I originally presented this data story recipe at the Africa Investigative Journalism Conference. But again, what I think is that it is really relevant to lots of different newsrooms around the world. So you can just screenshot that if you don't have the link already. But basically, we're going to go through and look at how we put together this data story recipe. So again, the goal of this data story recipe is journalists that are data curious can come here and they find everything they need to do their own data story recipe. So just to give people a little teaser, the first link at the top is a little fact sheet that we developed with the results. So if you do this data story recipe, these are kind of the findings that you will get at the end. So you'll see isolation beds for 100,000 people by each county, ICU beds per county, so people can kind of see if they follow the data story recipe correctly, what will their results look like. Okay, so the first thing I think we see a lot of journalists struggling with their pandemic coverage is how to explain all the different factors that influence how well a country handles the coronavirus. So healthcare infrastructure is really key to this. So what we look at basically is what healthcare infrastructure data is available in the country. Finding this data is one of the slowest parts of the process. So we found from the Ministry of Health, from the Healthcare Federation, from Open Africa, which is a data portal, we found in lots of different data sources little pieces of this information. And as journalists, what I always teach when I teach a data journalism story is we always start with the question. So what exactly do we want to know about healthcare access in Kenya? So basically, we came up with these list of questions, which I'm sure you'll find fairly straightforward. So where is the highest and lowest access to isolation beds for COVID-19 patients? There's an interesting dynamic between general ICU beds and isolated ICU beds, right? So as other people continue to get sick and need ICU beds, how many beds are available for them and how many beds are available to actual COVID-19 patients? Ventilators. Ventilators are a huge question around the world. Actually, in Africa, oxygen is also a really big problem, but we couldn't find data related to oxygen access. And then finally, for some of the context, which counties have the highest and lowest number of COVID-19 cases per capita, and how many counties actually meet the recommended numbers for both beds and ventilators. So when we teach data journalism, it's really important to teach how to ask the right questions, right? So teaching things like per capita, looking at inequality again, so who's doing the best and worst in the country, or the poorest regions doing the worst in terms of infrastructure. So basically now what we do, first we walk you through how do I find the data. So you guys should be able, starting from now, to follow this process exactly. So you can see where we found the relevant data sets. There's two big places that we found the data already in CSV files. So you can go to the Open Africa site, you can download the data sets. And then what I really try to emphasize in the data story recipe is really good practices for data hygiene. So really good documentation. So always making a copy of the data before you work with it, filling the source tab. So once you download the data, downloading the data, making a copy, and then really making sure that you understand the data that we have. Don't assume that you know what it means. What's the difference between an ICU bed and an ICU bed available for isolation? Look at definitions, call the data source so that you really know what it means. One thing that we were missing is we didn't have really good data about the number of confirmed coronavirus cases. So I took you through just the steps we did for trying to locate this data. We finally found it for this data story in a PDF produced by the Ministry of Health that was buried in its website. So we explain here how to extract the data from the PDF, how to clean the data. So once you've downloaded all the data sets, how to merge some of the data. So the treatment center data was not actually organized by county, it was organized by facility. So we go very much step by step through the process of how to clean this data, how to freeze the rows. And again, this should be within everybody's capacity to follow these instructions. So I'm going to skip to step 12, which is where we actually start to do the analysis. And we're going to share another link in case or step 11, sorry. If you want to do this analysis on your own, if you can share the link to the Google spreadsheet, you can actually just jump right in here if you want to. I've created a copy of the tab that we're working on in case you want to go ahead and do the calculations yourself. So I think one mistake we see a lot is people reporting the total number of ICU beds and not calculating the rate. So not calculating the access per 100,000 citizens. So we've explained how do we actually calculate the regular isolation beds per capita. So you take the number of beds available, you divide it by the population by 100,000. So I'm going to pause here a little bit to give you a chance to catch up. But you can see what we basically do is we've made it pretty easy for you to go right in to the data set. So you can see we have regular isolation beds available, irregular isolation beds available, critical care beds. And you can basically just follow along with calculating the cases per 100,000. You see we've started to do that here. So basically, we're basically showing journalists that it's not a super scary process to do this kind of calculations. If you want to do this, you're welcome to access. I forgot to mention you'll have to create a copy. So if you're here, you're going to have to go to File and create a copy because I have it as view only right now. And you can make a copy and follow on your own. And you can see that we've done here the calculation. For the beds, we also chose this example because it lets people do the same calculation over and over again because the basic steps are the same to calculate, whether you're calculating isolation beds, whether you're calculating rate for ICU beds, whether you're calculating ICU beds for 100,000 people, critical care beds. And so the idea here is that you can see we're getting the worst access in places like Kakamega and Nandi and Homa Bay. And the idea is really that journalists from these local areas can now also tell these kinds of stories. So no matter what county you're from in Kenya, you can do your own data story. Then we do calculating the prevalence, so the case prevalence per county. Okay. So obviously, this is not the entire story. The data is not great, but that's not really an excuse for not doing the data story. So the challenges we have are things like, testing is not very widespread. So there's a lot of case of death and undercounting happening. There's an issue with distribution of tests. So poor areas are often undercounting number of cases. It's difficult to actually figure out the causes of death. And then again, how do we really measure which communities are at risk? There is data available to really sort of cross the communities at risk. So looking at the poverty rate, looking at the healthcare spending per capita, life expectancy, things like that would really help put it more into context. So again, although this is about Kenya, the idea is that it would be a very similar process no matter what country that you're in. Okay, so there are some challenges with this approach, though. The first one I think we saw with the Kenya case is that data goes out of date really fast. So the last data we have from Kenya was for July. And basically, we didn't produce the data story recipe quickly enough for us to be able to do the story before the government basically said that they had new data. But the thing is, the government realized that we were doing the story and doing the analysis, so they didn't publish complete data for more recent dates. So now the story is basically that the government is withholding these numbers about how many ICU beds and how many isolation beds are now available. Another issue we have is that media houses are kind of reluctant to publish these kind of stories that are showing where the country is doing well and poorly. And then finally, journalists, they don't have a lot of incentive to produce these kinds of stories. A lot of them have to, publish 10 stories a week, and they don't really have this time to sit down and do this kind of data reporting. So I think one key challenge that we're working with is how do we incentivize journalists to do these kind of data-driven accountability stories. But again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is encourage the use of more localized data produced by local journalists and producing really locally relevant stories for their communities. So the data story recipe seems like just one part of this larger puzzle to get more data-driven reporting in the newsrooms. If you're interested in this model, there's a couple of different places you can go to find support. Hacks Hackers does this kind of work around the world. I mentioned Open News is where I borrowed the data story recipe idea from. European Journalism Center also runs a data journalism platform that's kind of lots of good tips. And then the Global Investigative Journalism Network has actually also produced sort of similar investigative story recipes around COVID-19. I'm also currently working on a data story recipe around deforestation, and I'm doing this with the Earth Journalism Network so that we could tell more data-driven stories about how deforestation has contributed to the rise of zoonotic diseases in a lot of these places that can trigger these pandemics. And again, we think that's a really good opportunity for journalists to tell localized stories about deforestation in their communities and make a sort of the larger case for how it has global influence, global impact on things like pandemics. Okay, great. I wanted to save about 20 minutes for conversation. I think we're there. So I am welcome to read through the chat. Oh, sorry. At one point I lost my screen. Sorry about that.
Hey, Eva.
Yep.
Hey, I'm chipping in. Sorry, nicely
Great.
done. A lot of key takeaways for data journalism and inclusiveness. Thank you for this lab session. And the audience has left some questions for you in the live chat. So, yeah, here is one from Merci Ross. And she's asking, do you think it's essential that the story you publish and the way you write in order to engage, that sometimes you can engage your audience more by the way you write instead of the story you publish, that it's more about writing the story?
Yeah, I think the language we use is really important. I think we forget that in the end, data journalism, it's just journalism. And how we tell stories and putting people at the center of the story continues to be really important. People don't care about data, they care about people, right? So if your story doesn't engage people and it doesn't show that human face, I don't think we're going to be successful in expanding our audiences.
Yes, totally understandable. All right, we have another question. It's from AL, and the question goes, tips to transition from a data analyst to a data journalist. Very interesting.
I think actually for the future, you're super in demand, our data analyst friend. I think what we see more and more is data journalism is probably not going to be sustainable or feasible unless we set up more partnerships with data analysts. Even when journalists, even if we set up something like a regression model, we kind of figure it out, we always consult with data analysts to confirm our methodology. So I think we see more and more everywhere from New York Times to our Kenyan media outlet. They really do work closely with analysts, whether it's sometimes if it's a civic hacking group, places like Bureau Local, big local news in the US, budget in Kenya. So like economic think tanks, climate change think tanks. I think more and more we see analysts from those institutions working really, really closely with journalists to make sure that we're producing really accurate coverage of these really technical issues in a way that's relatable to citizens. So I think finding your local data journalist community, again, like groups like Hacks Hackers, bring together analysts with journalists to kind of facilitate that discussion.
All right, interesting. Yes. So we have a next question. It's from Mr. El Bayar, and he says, "Hi, Eva. Thanks for the event." And he is wondering how to use efficient data miner extension. Do you have some tips about that?
Yeah, I have. Did you see that on my screen? I have data miner. So yeah, I think data. I don't know where you're from. There's a bit of issues. I've been doing a lot of data journalism in Arabic, and a lot of the tools that work pretty well in left to right languages are not so great in right to left. So for data scraping, if you have things like PDFs, Tabula is a really great tool. And a couple of years ago, I asked Tabula to actually activate right to left. So that's working more or less for scraping PDFs. Although we run into encoding issues, a lot of non-English languages have multiple encoding in PDFs, and they also use multiple fonts. So that's kind of actually one of the biggest questions that we've run into in languages like Burmese and Arabic, is how do we scrape PDFs and websites that have multiple encoding? And often what we're relying on is optical character recognition as kind of a workaround, or we scrape just the numbers using one of these traditional tools, and then we do hand entry of the column names, which again, these are workarounds, but like so far the technology is just not really there yet. So yeah, tools like table to clipboard, data miner, all of those extensions, they really do work better in left to right languages, but we see that improving rapidly, and often just kind of shooting a message to the developers. I've done that with Data Wrapper, I've done that with Tabula, and they just didn't know that they had an audience sort of outside the West, and they're actually very eager to make sure their tools are usable by journalists working in other languages.
All right. Okay. Nice. Thank you. Daphne is also here to ask a lot of questions, so I'll just pick the first one. You mentioned that editors and publishers should be educated and engage around data, data-driven topics and content. As a freelancer, how can one contribute to that?
Good luck. So I think one thing freelancers can do is when there's these grant opportunities, I think because there are quite a few grant opportunities to do data stories, but actually push back on the people offering the opportunity to ask them to connect you with newsrooms that are actually interested in reporting these kind of stories. Like I said, I think it's a mistake that a lot of funders don't take a more active role in expanding the numbers of editors and publishers that are engaging in this kind of journalism, because as a freelancer, it can be difficult. I think in your pitch, I would be very specific about what you've found. So if you've done the data analysis, your lead, don't bury your lead. You know, if your pitch, if for example in this you found that Kakamega has a shortage of ICU beds compared to the number of cases of COVID-19, have that be really clear in your pitch, and explain your methodologies for how you get there, so that the editors and publishers see this is really a story that you wouldn't be able to get to any other way. That really there's original reporting that comes out that you wouldn't be able to do without data.
All right, interesting. Yes. So I see a familiar name here in the chat, Ashley Kirk. Hi, Ashley. He says,
Hi,
really interesting talk, Eva. Thank you. And I wonder what your thoughts are on localized interactive, for example, passcode lookups as a way for national publications. And then another message, in particular, to localize their data journalism. I assume you think that doesn't go far enough to tackle, local coverage.
Yeah, I think the we did that in Kenya too, with kind of looking up your zip, like you could look up your county and see what like HIV spending was per person, and what we saw is most of the people accessing that page were still in Nairobi. So it was the very digital savvy people who were using that personalization feature. And there's just not that kind of media consumption patterns. What we actually found most effective was to have radio journalists do shorter radio pieces about the results for HIV spending in their county, and broadcasting them over radio. So I think we kind of still need to meet the audiences where they are. And as part of the audience research, really understanding their media consumption patterns and even their level of graphical literacy and data literacy, to make sure that you're telling them the story in a way they can relate to. I think that's sort of the first step. If we can engage them with data at that level, then we start to build the building blocks. So eventually maybe they'll visit our website. Eventually maybe they'll access our interactive or our news app. But don't expect them to make that leap. It's really our job as journalists to build that both data literacy and sort of the beat literacy around that topic, to bring them along to some of the more complex interactives.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we have one question left. It's from Sandro. He says, local data, local journalists, and local stories. Absolutely, yes. Great talk. But how can we also involve local communities to write and share their own stories?
Sure. And I think, that's one thing I didn't mention. I think when I do recruitment for a lot of the programs, a lot of the people who've really become great data journalists haven't actually been journalists. We've had a lot of students, we've had a lot of sort of people with political science, economic backgrounds. So bringing in local communities, I think, is really important in terms of audience engagement. So one thing we did in Kenya was we had a way for citizens to contribute cases of police shootings. So Nation Newsplex in Kenya did sort of the uncounted type of dashboard, crowdsourcing all of the extrajudicial police killings. And the way we really tried to engage communities is we were very transparent about the data we had and the way we got it. And then we had a way for them to submit cases of extrajudicial killings that we didn't know about. And we were very responsive about each case that was submitted. We investigated it thoroughly, and we reported back what we were able to find, whether or not we were able to confirm it or not. And we were very clear about the amount of time it was going to take us to investigate and respond to that specific case. So I think if you engage communities, it has to be in a very structured way, and you have to set expectations very clearly about what they can expect back from you. Because if they're giving, if they're contributing something, you have to be very clear about what response they can expect from you and how their story will then be represented in the media.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, I would like to wrap up, but I saw another question coming in, so I don't know if you have
Sure.
time to answer one question.
Sure.
All right, it's from Sakina, and it's a very interesting question. She's asking, in choosing what kind of data to highlight and include in our storytelling, is it better to write for the public with the goal of raising awareness, or to policymakers for policy changes?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think if it's not either or, I think you can create, and we've done this a lot, sort of create two different versions of the content depending on who you're trying to reach. So you might do more of like a long form news analysis piece for policymakers, distribute that on one of sort of the digital native online media outlets that you know that they reach, but then also make sure that your mass audience has access to that information too. And the important thing is to have both, because I'll give you an example. We did a story looking at food security in northern Kenya. And basically what we found was that it would be cheaper to use all humanitarian aid to grow food in the county than it is to buy food for everybody each year. So instead of buying food for everybody each year, if you just grow food, you could basically solve the food security issue. We did that story in two formats. The first was a 15-minute television piece that featured a family that was starving in Turkana. And the public response to that story was amazing. We got donations from across Kenya from people who wanted to help that specific family buy food, which was completely not the point of the piece. The point of the piece was stop buying emergency aid. But since tens of thousands of people wanted to donate money, policymakers saw that and got really embarrassed really fast. So policymakers actually saw the data. They asked us for the climate change data that we use. They asked us for a lot of the data. The World Bank asked us for the data. USAID asked for the data. So a lot of the donors wanted the data and the explanation. But what forced the government to respond was this huge sort of public backlash that was pretty unrelated to the data itself. It was pretty much an immediate sort of human reaction to, I want to help the families in the story. So the story was When the Sun Sets in Turkana. And I think without both of those elements, without the version that reached the policymakers, and without kind of the public outreach or outrage to this story, I don't think we would have had a policy change. And in the end, they did end up passing a food sustainability bill or a food security bill in Congress that has been implemented. But I don't think it would have happened unless it was both that headline TV news story and the more sort of wonky version for policymakers.
All right, very interesting, very interesting. People are asking if you can share your contact details because you would like to, to discuss with you or get in touch with you about certain projects and topics. So if it's okay with you,
Sure.
please
Yep,
share
that
it
would be
in the.
great. I'll share. Right now, I'm working in Jordan, Iraq, Myanmar, Thailand, but again, sort of always expanding. If anyone tries the Kenya data story recipe, it's open for feedback. Again, this is kind of a new model that we're trying to improve. We're going to publish the Global Forest Watch deforestation data recipe soon, and I'm happy to share that with anybody who's interested. So I think there's lots of opportunities to collaborate sort of on this model and expanding data access in the future.
All right. Well, thank you, Eva, for this interesting session. I wish you a great day, the rest of the day.